in the heart of ancient China, during the waning years of the Eastern Han Dynasty, where power was often defined by intrigue, ambition, and betrayal, there emerged a woman whose story would forever be intertwined with the fate of the empire, Empress Guo Li, the wife of Emperor Han, a ruler whose reign would be marked by both triumph and turmoil. Born into a family of modest means, Guo Li never sought power, nor did she dream of becoming an empress. Yet, fate had a different plan. Her path collided with that of Lu Xiong, the young prince who would later become Emperor Zhang. Their story was not one of predetermined destiny, but rather a tale of chance, ambition, and love. Guo Li's rise from an obscure concubine to the most powerful woman in the empire is a testament to her intelligence, political acumen, and ability to navigate the treacherous waters of palace intrigue. When Lu Xiong ascended to the throne as Emperor Zhang, he was a young man, eager to lead but burdened by the challenges of ruling an empire in decline. The political landscape was fraught with instability, and the emperor found himself beset on all sides by rival factions and power struggles within the imperial court. It was here, in the midst of this turbulence, that Guo Li's true abilities began to shine. As empress, Guo Li would not only stand by her husband's side but would also become his most trusted confidant, his strategic partner, and the one person he could rely on to navigate the complex web of politics that defined the imperial palace. Her influence would extend far beyond the ceremonial role of a queen. She would play a pivotal role in shaping the policies of the empire, guiding her husband's decisions, and ensuring the survival of her children in a world where the line between ally and enemy was razor-thin. But Guo Li's story was not one of mere political maneuvering. It was also one of love, sacrifice, and the delicate balance between personal ambition and the welfare of her family and empire. Her journey from a young woman of no particular standing to the most powerful empress in China is a remarkable one, filled with moments of tension, triumph, and tragedy. This is the story of Guo Li, the empress who shaped the future of the Han Dynasty, and of Lu Xiong, the emperor who stood beside her. Together, they would face the challenges of ruling an empire on the brink of collapse. With the weight of history pressing down on them, their tale is one of ambition, betrayal, and the eternal struggle for power, love, and legacy. The sun hung low over the city of Luoyang, casting long shadows over the imperial palace. The grand halls of the Han Dynasty were filled with the weight of history, and yet within these walls, a new chapter was about to be written, one that would change the course of the empire forever. In the heart of the court, amidst the opulence and power, a young woman stood quietly, her eyes scanning the room with a calm resolve that belied her youth. This was Guo Li, a woman whose name would one day be spoken with reverence and awe. Yet at this moment, she was just another face in the crowd. Born into a family of modest means, Guo Li had never imagined a life of grandeur. Her father, a minor official in the provincial government, had hoped for little more than a stable existence for his children. Her mother, ever practical, taught her daughter the virtues of humility, obedience, and perseverance, qualities that would serve her well as she navigated the treacherous waters of the imperial court. As a young girl, Guo Li had shown a remarkable intelligence and grace, catching the attention of those who saw her as more than just a simple beauty. She was thoughtful, calculating, and, above all, capable of understanding the subtle dynamics of power and influence, a skill that would prove invaluable in the years to come. But it was not until her early adulthood that Guo Li's fate would change forever. As a young woman, she was brought to the imperial palace to serve as one of the many concubines vying for the favor of the future emperor. Liu Song, the emperor-to-be, known later as Emperor Chuangde, was a man of considerable ambition but uncertain temperament. The early years of his reign had been marked by political instability and infighting within the court. Rival factions vied for control, and power was won not by loyalty or righteousness but by cunning, deception, and strategic alliances. It was into this volatile environment that Guo Li entered, her beauty and intelligence drawing the attention of those around her. but it was her mind that would ultimately capture the attention of the emperor himself. Lu Xiong was not a man easily swayed by outward appearances. He had learned the hard way that true loyalty was a rare commodity in the halls of power, where trust could be as fleeting as a whisper in the wind. But there was something about Guo Li, something beyond her calm demeanor and graceful poise, that intrigued him. Perhaps it was the way she held herself in the midst of the turmoil, or the way she spoke with such quiet authority in her conversations with the other concubines. Whatever it was, Lu Xiong found himself drawn to her in a way he had never felt before. It wasn't long before Guo Li found herself in the position of favored concubine, her influence over the future emperor growing by the day. Yet, unlike the other women in the palace, who competed with one another through beauty or charm, Guo Li wielded a different kind of power. She understood the language of politics, the subtle game of alliances and rivalries that defined the court. She saw herself not just as a concubine, but as a potential partner in the empire's future. The early days of Lu Xiong's reign were a time of crisis. The Han Dynasty was fractured, its glory days far behind it. Factions of the nobility jockeyed for control, and the emperor's own position was precarious. Many of the emperor's advisors were loyal to their own ambitions rather than to the empire. Within this environment, Guo Li played a crucial role. She recognized the need for unity, for consolidating power if Lu Xiong was to survive the shifting tides of court politics. She became a confidant to him, someone he trusted not just with matters of the court, but with matters of state. First, her role was subtle. She offered counsel, gently guiding him through the intricate web of politics. Her advice was often practical, focused on maintaining balance within the court, ensuring that the emperor's enemies were kept in check without alienating potential allies. Guo Li's presence brought a sense of calm to Lu Xiong's increasingly chaotic world. He came to rely on her judgment, even when it meant making decisions that would anger powerful factions within the empire. But as her influence grew, so too did the dangers she faced. In the world of imperial China, no position was ever secure. Rivals within the palace grew jealous of Guo Li's rising status, and whispers of conspiracy began to swirl in the shadows. It was said that a woman in the emperor's favor was a woman who invited danger, for there was no shortage of men willing to strike down a rival to win the favor of the ruler. But Guo Li was no ordinary woman. She had learned from her mother the importance of discretion and patience, and she had already begun to shape the minds of those around her. One of the emperor's most trusted advisors, a man named Wang Bo, took notice of Guo Li's rise. His own faction within the court had been struggling for influence, and he saw the young concubine as a potential threat to his power. However, Wang Bo underestimated Guo Li. She had no desire to challenge his authority directly. Instead, she worked behind the scenes, securing her place within the emperor's inner circle by cultivating relationships with those whose loyalty was uncertain. She slowly built her network of allies, men and women who shared her vision for a united empire. Men and women who knew that the future of the Han Dynasty depended on the success of Lu Xiong's rule. As time passed, Guo Li's role in the court became more public. She was no longer just a concubine. She was the emperor's closest confidant, his most trusted advisor, and in the eyes of many, the true power behind the throne. Her relationship with Lu Xiong was more than just that of a husband and wife. They were partners in every sense of the word, each one relying on the other to navigate the dangerous waters of imperial politics. Together, they would face the challenges of ruling an empire on the brink of collapse. But the road to power was not without its challenges. Guo Li would soon find herself in the midst of plots and betrayals, her influence tested by those who sought to bring her down. She would have to rely on her wits, her cunning, and her loyalty to Lu Xiong to survive the trials that lay ahead. Her rise from a simple concubine to Empress of the Han Dynasty was no accident. It was the result of careful planning, strategic alliances, and a keen understanding of the delicate balance of power that governed the empire. But above all, it was driven by a singular ambition: the ambition to see Lu Xiong secure his place as emperor, and to ensure that their family would be the one to shape the future of the Han Dynasty. The transition from concubine to empress was never a simple one, especially in the palace of Emperor Lu Xiong. As Guo Li's influence over the young emperor continued to grow, so did the animosities within the court. The emperor's rise to power had been fraught with challenges, internal revolts, external threats, and a palace filled with rivals hungry for influence. To survive in this brutal environment, Guo Li would need to hone not just her political acumen, but also her ability to navigate the dangerous waters of betrayal, jealousy, and shifting allegiances. When Guo Li was formally crowned empress, the court held its breath. Her elevation, though seen by many as inevitable, was still a dramatic shift. In the traditional structure of the Han Dynasty, empresses were chosen not just for their beauty or grace, but for their ability to solidify political alliances and secure the succession of heirs. Lu Xiong, still a relatively young ruler, found himself surrounded by powerful families, each with its own agenda. The Lu family, in particular, had its own faction, and other noble houses were watching closely, calculating how they could use the emperor's newfound bride to their advantage. Guo Li's first challenge as empress came in the form of her relationship with the powerful noble families. The empress was supposed to be a unifying figure, but with Lu Xiong's reign still unstable, Guo Li found herself facing off against ambitious generals, scheming courtiers, and even members of her own family who saw the imperial court as their own personal chessboard. Her political instincts had served her well up to this point, but now she would have to employ every ounce of her cunning, charm, and intelligence to maintain her position. The first sign of trouble came from the Imperial Council, where one of the leading figures, an ambitious general named Zhang Kuei, openly questioned Guo Li's legitimacy as empress. Zhang Kuei, a man who had been a military leader long before Lu Xiong ascended the throne, saw the young empress as a threat to the old power structure. His faction, which controlled much of the military power, believed that the emperor's true strength lay in their support, not in the fragile politics of the court. Zhang Kuei had once been a trusted advisor to Lu Xiong's father, and he saw the young emperor as weak, easily swayed by his wife's counsel. In his eyes, the power of the emperor should not be determined by a woman's influence but by the military strength that he, Zhang Kuei, could provide. It was a common sentiment in many parts of the empire. Power was never truly in the hands of the emperor alone, but in the alliances he could forge with the military and the nobility. Guo Li, however, had no intention of being cowed by Zhang Kuei or anyone else. She understood better than most that, in the imperial court, appearances were everything, and the slightest misstep could lead to one's downfall. What Zhang Kuei did not realize, however, was that Guo Li's rise was not based solely on her relationship with the emperor, but on her understanding of the empire's delicate balance of power. She knew that if she could secure the loyalty of the right people, military leaders, courtiers, and members of the royal family, she could neutralize threats like Zhang Kuei. The first step in her strategy was to strengthen her ties with the emperor's closest advisors. These men and women had been with Lu Xiong for much of his life and held sway in the imperial court. Guo Li began cultivating relationships with them, often meeting with them in private, listening to their concerns, and offering her own counsel. Slowly, she began to turn these advisors into her allies, carefully winning their trust and loyalty. She played the role of the empress well, not just as a figurehead but as a trusted partner, someone who understood the intricacies of governance. Her most valuable ally, however, was the emperor himself. Lu Xiong, despite his early uncertainty, had grown to depend on Guo Li in ways he had never expected. Their relationship was not one of simple husband and wife, but a partnership born of necessity. The emperor knew that without Guo Li's wisdom, he would be a puppet in the hands of more powerful men. He relied on her for guidance, for clarity in the murky waters of court politics. Together, they made decisions that would shape the future of the empire. often in ways that surprised even their closest allies. As the months passed, Guo Li's influence continued to grow. She was no longer just an advisor. She was the emperor's closest confidant, his most trusted partner. Her role in the imperial court expanded, and so too did her power. But with this newfound power came new dangers. Her enemies, sensing her strength, began to circle, and whispers of treason and betrayal filled the air. One of her greatest threats came from an unexpected quarter, the emperor's own family. The Lu family, though loyal to the emperor, had its own ambitions, and the rising influence of Guo Li did not sit well with everyone. There were those who saw the empress as a woman who sought to supplant the traditional power structures of the royal family, and they feared that she would use her position to elevate her own family at the expense of their own. The tension between the Lu family and Guo Li came to a head when one of the emperor's cousins, Lu Heng, a young and ambitious man, openly challenged the empress's authority. Lu Heng, backed by several influential members of the Lu clan, made a bold move to discredit Guo Li by spreading rumors of her supposed manipulation of the emperor. He claimed that she was using her position as empress to control the affairs of the empire and that Lu Xiong was little more than a puppet. This accusation, though false, was a dangerous one in a court as divided as the Han. The mere suggestion of a power struggle between the emperor and his empress was enough to create chaos. For the first time, Guo Li found herself vulnerable. She had no choice but to act quickly to neutralize the threat before it grew beyond control. With characteristic cunning, Guo Li orchestrated a series of meetings with the leading members of the Lu family, using her charm and political savvy to appeal to their sense of loyalty to the emperor and the empire. She reminded them that the Han Dynasty could not afford to fall victim to internal divisions, and that their family's unity was the key to preserving their power. At the same time, she subtly undermined Lu Heng's position, questioning his loyalty and casting doubt on his ambitions. In the end, Guo Li's strategy succeeded. Lu Heng's challenge to the empress's authority was met with resistance from other members of the Lu family, who recognized the danger of internal conflict. The matter was quietly resolved, and Lu Heng's power was diminished. Guo Li, once again, had proven her ability to outmaneuver her enemies, securing her position as empress and reaffirming her power within the court. But as Guo Li consolidated her influence, new challenges arose. The empire was facing increasing pressure from external threats, rebellions in the western provinces, incursions from nomadic tribes to the north, and the growing instability of the imperial administration. The emperor, though wise in many ways, was still young, and the burdens of leadership weighed heavily on him. It was in this context that Guo Li's role as empress truly began to evolve. She was no longer just a political advisor. She was becoming the de facto ruler of the empire, guiding the emperor's decisions in both domestic and foreign affairs. Her influence extended beyond the imperial palace. As the Han Dynasty teetered on the brink of collapse, Guo Li became a symbol of strength and stability in a world where both were in short supply. Her ability to navigate the complex web of politics, her mastery of court intrigues, and her unshakable loyalty to her husband ensured that she would remain one of the most powerful women in Chinese history. The imperial palace of Luoyang, though magnificent in its splendor, was a place where shadows lurked in every corner. It was a court teeming with ambition, deceit, and betrayal, where alliances were forged in whispers and loyalty was as fragile as a candle's flame. For Empress Guo Li, this reality had long since become her battleground, a place where survival required not just wisdom but a ruthless understanding of those around her. As the years passed, her influence over Emperor Lu Xiong solidified, yet so did the threats that sought to destroy her and her family. The first true test of her strength came when she faced a direct challenge from within the emperor's inner circle. A rival faction, led by a high-ranking official named Yang Ji, had grown restless under Guo Li's growing dominance in the court. Yang Ji, a man of immense ambition, had long been a power broker in the palace, his connections to the military and noble families stretching deep. His initial support of Guo Li had been born of necessity. He saw in her an opportunity to advance his own position, but as her power increased, so did his resentment. What had once been an alliance of convenience soon turned into an open rivalry. Yang Ji, like many others before him, underestimated the Empress's intelligence. He saw her as a mere political pawn in a man's world, believing that her rise had been due to her beauty and her marriage to the emperor, not her intellect or political cunning. His mistake was a costly one. The seeds of betrayal were planted in subtle conversations, whispered behind closed doors, as Yang Ji worked to turn the emperor's closest advisors against Guo Li. He painted her as a manipulative woman, one who sought to control Lu Xiong and weaken the power of the court. He spread rumors that Guo Li had been influencing military decisions for her own benefit, undermining the empire's stability in favor of her personal ambitions. To many in the court, the accusation seemed plausible. After all, what empress had ever been so involved in matters of state? What woman had ever wielded such influence? For a time, the whispers grew louder, and the atmosphere in the palace became charged with suspicion. Lu Xiong, though deeply in love with Guo Li, began to doubt the loyalty of those around him. His advisors, divided as they were, fed him contradictory information. Some claimed that Guo Li was merely a devoted empress, while others painted her as a dangerous player who had begun to surpass her husband in power. The tension between the two sides reached a breaking point when Yang Ji made his move. One evening, as the emperor hosted a private council meeting, Yang Ji presented a dossier of documents, false reports, forged letters, and fabricated testimonies that painted Guo Li as the mastermind behind a covert plot to undermine the imperial army. The evidence, though flimsy, was enough to cast doubt in Lu Xiong's mind. In a moment of vulnerability, he questioned his wife's actions in front of his advisors, and the room fell silent. Guo Li, ever composed, remained still, her gaze fixed on the emperor. For the first time in their marriage, the empress found herself on the defensive. She knew that this moment could be a turning point, a breaking point. If she failed to convince Lu Xiong of her loyalty, everything she had worked for would crumble. She would lose her place at his side, and with it, the power she had so carefully nurtured. But Guo Li was no ordinary woman. She had been preparing for this moment for years, with a calmness that belied the storm raging within her. Guo Li stood and addressed the emperor. She did not plead for his trust. Instead, she appealed to his sense of reason. She reminded him of the loyalty she had shown since the beginning, the sacrifices she had made for the empire, and the care with which she had helped him navigate the treacherous world of the court. She spoke of the empire's fragility, of the necessity for unity in the face of external threats, and the importance of standing together to secure the future of their family and their people. Lu Xiong, though conflicted, listened intently. He knew that Guo Li had never lied to him, but doubt had begun to seep into his mind. He was torn between his love for her and the weight of the accusations against her. But Guo Li's words were measured and logical. She did not resort to theatrics or desperation. Instead, she calmly dismantled the accusations, offering explanations for each piece of supposed evidence and suggesting that Yang Ji's faction had forged the documents to manipulate him. It was a masterstroke. The emperor, unable to ignore his wife's wisdom and clarity, ordered an investigation into the matter. Yang Ji's plot quickly unraveled as Guo Li had anticipated. His lies were exposed, and his faction's power was shattered. In the wake of the scandal, Yang Ji was removed from his post and exiled, his influence reduced to nothing. For Guo Li, this was a victory not just over a political rival, but over the forces that sought to tear apart her family and her reign. But the cost of this victory was high. Though Yang Ji had been eliminated, the court remained divided. The factions that had once supported him now turned their attention to other rivals, each seeking to increase their own power at the expense of Guo Li's. The empress was no longer just a figurehead. She had become the symbol of power within the court, and as such, She was a target for those who sought to diminish her influence. The tensions in the palace reached their peak during the annual Spring Festival, a time when the emperor hosted a great feast to celebrate the unity of the empire. This year's festival, however, would be anything but peaceful. In a bold move, one of Guo Li's former allies, an influential noblewoman named Lady Wu, betrayed her, aligning herself with a faction of high-ranking military officers who were dissatisfied with the current leadership. Lady Wu, who had once owed her position to the Empress's support, now saw an opportunity to elevate her own family by siding with the Emperor's enemies. The betrayal was swift and brutal. Lady Wu, with the help of several military leaders, attempted to orchestrate a coup during the festival, planning to seize control of the Emperor and force him to dismiss Guo Li. The plan was to strike during the banquet, when the court would be distracted by the celebrations. They believed that, with the Empress out of the picture, Lu Xiong would be easily manipulated into appointing one of their own as the new chief advisor. Once again, Guo Li found herself caught in the web of palace intrigue. She had not anticipated this particular betrayal, but she was no stranger to danger. As the festival began, she could feel the tension in the air, the subtle shifts in the mood, the nervous glances exchanged by the courtiers. It didn't take long for her to realize that something was amiss. Guo Li moved quickly, her mind working in overdrive. She subtly signaled to her loyal supporters within the palace guard, instructing them to quietly seal the exits and ensure that no one left the hall without permission. She used the distractions of the evening, the laughter, the music, and the feasting, to mask her actions as she secretly alerted Lu Xiong. She knew that the emperor could not afford to remain unaware of the coup attempt for much longer. Just as Lady Wu and her allies made their move, Guo Li had already taken control of the situation. With precision and calm, she orchestrated a counterstrike, exposing the conspiracy to the emperor in a way that left no room for doubt. Lady Wu's betrayal was exposed for all to see, and the military officers who had supported her were arrested and removed from their posts. Once again, Guo Li had turned a moment of potential disaster into a triumph. But this victory, like the last, came with a price. The conspirators, humiliated and defeated, sought revenge in the months that followed, continuing to plot against the Empress from the shadows. Guo Li knew that this was the nature of power. It was a constant struggle, one where the lines between ally and enemy were always shifting. As the court settled into a new, uneasy peace, Guo Li remained ever vigilant. She had proven herself time and time again, but she knew that the true challenge lay ahead. The greatest threats to her power were yet to come, and the game of politics was far from over. Guo Li sat in the dimly lit chambers of the imperial palace, her fingers tapping the edge of a lacquered desk. The palace had grown quiet in the aftermath of the festival and the attempted coup. The air was thick with suspicion, and the court had begun to fragment once more. The whispers that had once called her a puppet master now spoke in more hushed tones, admiring the way she had handled the betrayal and turned it into yet another victory. But victories, she knew, were fleeting in a place like this. For every ally she gained, another enemy rose in her wake. She could no longer afford to be complacent. The stakes had grown higher. Every decision she made now carried with it the weight of the empire's future. As Empress, Guo Li had long understood that her role was to protect the throne and secure the dynasty. But what she hadn't fully realized was the extent to which the very nature of power in the court was in flux. It was no longer just about maintaining the emperor's favor. It was about controlling the entire apparatus of the state. From the military to the bureaucracy, every branch of the empire had its own vested interests, and it was in this world of competing factions and ambitions that she had to forge her place. The emperor, despite his affection for her, was still young and impressionable. Lu Xiong was a ruler at a crossroads, caught between his personal attachments and the pragmatic realities of his reign. He had grown dependent on Guo Li for counsel, but he was not blind to the growing influence she held. Her role as empress had expanded far beyond that of a consort. She had become a true partner in governance, a crucial force in the empire's political and military decisions. And yet, despite her power, she was still a woman, a fact that many in the court could not and would not ignore. The tension between her and the male-dominated political elite of the Han court was palpable. Her every move was scrutinized, and her political enemies seemed to multiply by the day. One of the most persistent threats came from the remnants of the faction loyal to Yang Ji, who, despite his exile, continued to pull strings from the shadows. He had supporters among the military officers, bureaucrats, and even within the imperial family. These supporters believed that Guo Li's growing power was a dangerous threat to the traditional structures of governance, and they would stop at nothing to see her downfall. In response to this, Guo Li intensified her efforts to shore up her influence. She knew that she could not afford to sit idly by while her enemies conspired against her. Every corner of the court was a battleground, and the Empress would need to act decisively. One of her first moves was to strengthen her ties to the military. She had already made significant inroads with key generals, but now she focused on deepening those relationships, particularly with General Guo Wei, a respected leader of the southern provinces. Guo Wei was a man of integrity, a warrior who had fought tirelessly to protect the empire from external threats. But he was also a man who valued loyalty above all else. Guo Li knew that by securing his allegiance, she could fortify her position and neutralize much of the opposition from the military. The general's loyalty was not easily won, but Guo Li proved herself adept at navigating the delicate balance of power. She offered him substantial military resources, promising that the southern provinces would receive greater autonomy and support from the capital. In exchange, Guo Wei pledged his allegiance to the Empress, agreeing to support her in any future conflicts. This alliance was a significant step in securing Guo Li's control over the military, a vital tool in her arsenal. But not all of her efforts would be so easily achieved. One of the most difficult challenges she faced came from within her own family. Though Guo Li had risen to prominence through her marriage to Lu Xiong, her relationship with her own relatives was far more complicated. Her brothers, who had once supported her rise, now found themselves caught in the crossfire of palace politics. They were seen as potential rivals to the imperial throne. And as the Empress's influence grew, so did the suspicions surrounding her family. It was her younger brother, Quoch Vu, who became the target of a malicious rumor that spread like wildfire throughout the court. The rumor suggested that Quoch Vu was plotting to take the throne for himself, using his sister's position as a stepping stone to power. The accusation was groundless, but in the world of imperial politics, the mere suggestion of such a plot could be deadly. Guo Li, ever the strategist, moved quickly to discredit the rumor. She called in her brother, who was stationed in the capital as a trusted official, and demanded that he clear his name publicly. The Empress knew that the court would not simply take her word for it. They would need to see action. In a carefully orchestrated public event, Quoch Vu appeared before the Emperor and the council, pledging his unwavering loyalty to Lu Xiong and reaffirming that he had never entertained any thoughts of rebellion. His public confession was enough to quell the rising doubts, and the rumor quickly faded. But the damage had been done. Quoch Vu's reputation had been tarnished, and his position in the court weakened. This incident, though resolved, had a lasting effect on Guo Li. She realized that the threat to her power was not just external but internal as well. Her family, her closest allies, were vulnerable to the shifting tides of court politics. She could no longer afford to rely on the loyalty of her own kin alone. She needed to build new alliances with those who were not bound by blood but by mutual interest. Her next move was to reach out to the scholars and intellectuals who populated the imperial bureaucracy. In an empire as vast as Han China, the scholars held immense power. They were the ones who advised the emperor on matters of law, governance, and philosophy. By securing their loyalty, Guo Li could neutralize the influence of the bureaucratic factions that had grown hostile to her. She personally invited several of the most influential scholars to the palace, engaging them in conversations about the future of the empire, the importance of stability, and the role of the empress in shaping the dynasty's future. She deftly used her intellect and political savvy to win their trust, speaking not just as an empress but as a fellow scholar and strategist. Over time, these intellectuals began to see her as a legitimate force in the court, and their support became another pillar in her consolidation of power. But just as she seemed to have her political situation under control, disaster struck. A massive rebellion broke out in the western provinces, fueled by unrest among the peasantry and exacerbated by the growing corruption of local officials. The rebellion threatened to destabilize the empire, and Guo Li knew that she would have to act quickly to prevent it from spreading to the capital. She urged the emperor to send reinforcements to the region, but Lu Xiong, ever cautious, hesitated. The rebellion was massive, and the costs of war were high. It was in this moment of crisis that Guo Li's leadership truly came to the forefront. Seeing that the emperor lacked the decisiveness to act, she took matters into her own hands. With the emperor's reluctant blessing, she ordered a large-scale military campaign to suppress the rebellion. Her plan was swift and decisive. She would send a contingent of troops led by General Guo Wei, along with a contingent of elite imperial guards, to the western provinces. The goal was not just to crush the rebellion, but to restore the people's faith in the emperor's ability to govern. The campaign was brutal, but it was also effective. Within months, the rebellion was quashed, and the region was brought back under imperial control. Guo Li's swift actions not only saved the empire from further turmoil, but also solidified her reputation as a ruler in her own right. She had proven that she could lead when necessary, even when the emperor faltered. Yet, even as she stood victorious, Guo Li knew that her power remained tenuous. The court, though cowed by her success, was still filled with factions eager to undermine her. Her family's position was still fragile, and the emperor's dependence on her, though strong, was not enough to guarantee her position indefinitely. Guo Li's challenges were far from over. She had won this battle, but the war for control of the Han Dynasty was still raging. The question that lingered in her mind, and one she would have to confront in the coming years, was whether she could maintain her position in the face of unrelenting opposition, or whether the cost of power would eventually consume her. As she stood by the emperor's side in the aftermath of the rebellion, Guo Li couldn't help but wonder if she had already begun to pay the price of her ambition. The sun was setting over the capital, casting long shadows across the imperial palace in Luoyang. The air had a crispness to it that heralded the coming of winter. But within the palace walls, the temperature was always warm, the halls filled with intrigue, ambition, and the constant hum of court politics. For Guo Li, Empress of the Han Dynasty, the palace was a world she had long come to understand and manipulate with ease. Yet, even now, she knew that her reign was far from secure. The political landscape had shifted again, and this time, the stakes were higher than ever. It had been years since she had first ascended to the position of empress, navigating the intricate web of court alliances, military strategies, and betrayals. Her relationship with Emperor Lu Xiong had weathered numerous storms, and the loyalty of her supporters had been tested time and again. But as time passed, Guo Li found herself standing at the precipice of an empire that was beginning to fracture. The outer provinces, once stable under imperial rule, were now showing signs of rebellion. Discontent among the peasants was rising, exacerbated by the harsh tax burdens imposed by corrupt local officials. Meanwhile, the elites of the court, those who had once been loyal to her, were now growing increasingly restless. The more powerful she became, the more dangerous it seemed to those who had once supported her. The factions that had once helped her rise to power were now seeking to bring her down, and the whispers of rebellion were once again becoming louder. The once unified court had splintered into factions, each with their own ambitions and desires. Some still supported the emperor and sought to preserve the imperial family's traditional authority. Others had turned against Guo Li, viewing her as an obstacle to their own power. Lu Xiong, though still deeply in love with his empress, had grown increasingly uncertain. His earlier dependence on her had become strained, as he struggled to balance his feelings with the pressures of his court. The young emperor had come to see that his wife was no longer just his consort. She was a power in her own right, and many in the court feared that her influence had grown too great. Guo Li, ever perceptive, could sense the growing discontent. She had seen the signs, subtle shifts in behavior, hushed conversations behind closed doors, and, most telling of all, the way her once loyal allies had begun to distance themselves. She knew that she could not afford to rest on her laurels. If she was to maintain her position and secure the future of her family, she would need to act decisively once more. The first blow came when one of her most trusted generals, General Guo Wei, was implicated in a plot to assassinate the emperor. The accusation, though unfounded, sent shockwaves through the court. Guo Wei had long been a staunch ally of Guo Li, and his military prowess had been a key factor in her ability to consolidate power. To have him implicated in such a scandal was not just a personal betrayal, it was a threat to the very stability of the empire. Guo Li knew that she could not allow such a scandal to go unanswered. If the emperor believed the accusations, it would be the end of her reign. She moved quickly, calling for an emergency council to address the matter. At the council, she presented evidence that exposed the conspiracy behind the plot, an elaborate scheme orchestrated by a rival faction of court officials who sought to discredit her and weaken her control over the military. The plot had been fabricated to sow distrust between her and her most loyal supporters. The Empress's political acumen was on full display as she deftly turned the tables on her enemies. She not only cleared Guo Wei's name but also exposed the faction behind the plot, ensuring that their power was broken once and for all. The victory was significant, but it came at a cost. Though the immediate threat was neutralized, the damage to her reputation was lasting. Her enemies had learned a valuable lesson. Even the most trusted of allies could be turned against her if the right circumstances were created. In the months that followed, Guo Li turned her attention to the growing unrest in the provinces. The rebellion in the west had not been fully quelled, and now the eastern regions were also showing signs of discontent. The tax burdens, the corruption of local officials, and the disillusionment of the common people had sparked widespread revolt. The emperor, still hesitant to act decisively, left the responsibility to his empress. It was Guo Li who once again took control of the situation, dispatching military forces to suppress the uprisings. Her decision to lead the campaign herself was a bold one. It was clear that the emperor, despite his affection for her, was no longer able to govern effectively without her guidance. Guo Li's reputation as a capable leader had been solidified in the court, but now she had to prove it on the battlefield. As the leader of the imperial forces, she led a campaign of swift retribution against the rebels, showing no mercy to those who dared defy the emperor's rule. The campaign was brutal, but it was effective. The rebellion was crushed, and the eastern provinces were restored to imperial control. But the victory came at a cost. The brutality of the suppression left a trail of resentment among the people. The common folk, who had once viewed Guo Li as a savior, now began to see her as a symbol of the empire's oppressive rule. In the eyes of many, the empress had become a figure of tyranny, one who was willing to crush any dissent in her pursuit of power. Despite this, Guo Li's position within the palace remained strong. She had demonstrated her ability to restore order and protect the empire, and the emperor's dependence on her had only deepened. Yet, even as her power solidified, she could not ignore the growing threats to her reign. The factions within the court, emboldened by her recent victories, began to stir once more. Rival claimants to the throne emerged, each hoping to gain the favor of the emperor and supplant Guo Li's influence. It was during this period of growing instability that Guo Li made a fateful decision. Realizing that her control over the empire could not be guaranteed as long as there were rivals within the court, she took steps to secure her own legacy. She began to position her son, Lu Shua, as the rightful heir to the throne. Though Lu Shua was still a young boy, Guo Li knew that the future of the dynasty depended on her ability to secure his position. The move was a calculated one. By placing her son in line for the throne, Guo Li could solidify her own power as the regent, ensuring that the imperial family remained under her control for years to come. But this move also put her at odds with the other factions in the court, who saw her son as a threat to their own ambitions. They began to rally around Lu Xiong's cousins and distant relatives, hoping to elevate one of them to the throne and remove Guo Li from power once and for all. The battle for the future of the dynasty had begun. In the midst of this growing conflict, Guo Li found herself facing a series of challenges unlike any she had encountered before. The political landscape was shifting rapidly, and her enemies were growing more brazen in their attempts to undermine her. But Guo Li was not one to back down easily. She had survived every challenge that had been thrown her way, and she was determined to secure her legacy. The final confrontation came when Lu Xiong's cousins, backed by a powerful faction of military leaders, launched a direct challenge to her authority. They attempted to have Lu Xiong removed from the throne, citing his inability to govern effectively and accusing him of being under the influence of his wife. The court was thrown into chaos as rival factions clashed in a battle for control of the empire. In the end, it was Guo Li's cunning and political savvy that prevailed. Using her influence over the emperor and the military, she was able to outmaneuver her enemies and secure her son's position as the future ruler of the empire. The rivals who had once threatened her reign were removed from power, and her control over the court was solidified. But the cost of this victory was high. The empire, though united once again, was left fractured by the infighting that had torn it apart. The common people, who had once viewed Guo Li as a symbol of stability, now saw her as the architect of their suffering. Her reputation as a capable ruler had been overshadowed by the brutality of her reign, and the long-term consequences of her actions would reverberate throughout the dynasty for generations to come. As Empress, Guo Li had achieved unparalleled power. She had secured her son's position on the throne, ensuring the continuation of her family's rule. But in doing so, she had also laid the foundation for the eventual downfall of the Han Dynasty. The empire she had fought so hard to protect would eventually crumble under the weight of internal strife. And Guo Li's legacy, though lasting, would be forever marred by the ruthless decisions she had made in her pursuit of power. And so, the story of Guo Li came to its bittersweet conclusion. She had won the game of power, but in doing so, she had lost something far more precious: the trust of the people and the stability of the empire she had worked so hard to build.